All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our series on JavaScript marathon training. Basically, this is a series of trainings that this.labs is providing the community. We cover React, Vue, Angular, RxJS, and web performance. My name is Frederik Prijk. I'm a senior software engineer at this.labs. You can find me on Twitter using the handle mentioned on the bottom of the screen, which is my first and last name. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, feedbacks, or concerns. Do you also find keeping up with the latest technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed with the latest technologies? Well, I have some good news. This.labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs. We try to ensure you and your company stay on the leading edge. Please do not hesitate to contact us at hi@this.co. Of course, our sponsor for today is this.labs, your partner in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. You can find more at our website, which is this.labs.com, or you can also send us an email at hi@this.co. In today's session, called 1 Hour to Learn Angular, we will cover some basics in order to get you up and running with Angular. The demo that I will be working at throughout this session will be using Angular version 9. However, none of the content is specific to version 9, so no worries if you are still on an earlier version. You'll still be able to follow along and bring it over to your own application. So first things first, let's head over to my command line. When you are working with Angular, we use the Angular CLI. Angular CLI is a command line interface that allows you to do amazing stuff. One of the things that it allows you is to create an Angular application. Before you're able to use it, of course, we'll need to install the Angular CLI, which you can install globally using npm install -g/@Angular CLI. I already have it, of course, but once you have it installed, you should have a command available called ng, right? If you would run ng, it will give you every available command that you have for the Angular CLI. As you can see, we have the command like add, analytics, build, deploy. There's a lot more. We are obviously not going to cover all of them, but everything starts with a new command. The new command is what you can use to create a new Angular application. So basically, if you would use ng-new, you can give it any name. Before doing it like this, ng-new. You give it any name. It will basically give you a few questions, and it will create an Angular application for you. The first question it asks you is whether or not you want to add routing. In a general application, you probably want to use routing. For this demo, we are going to skip routing and focus on the core parts of an Angular application. Of course, routing is probably considered a core part as well. But we cannot cover everything in just an hour. So we would hit no for the router. And then you get a prompt to ask which style sheet you want to use. Sorry for the font size. And thanks for pointing that out. And so basically, it prompts you for which style sheet you want to use. In this case, you can use CSS, Sass, SCSS, less, or stylus. I'm going to go with SCSS. Basically, that's all the questions you have. And now an application is created. You can see all the files that are created, and it's going to install all the npm packages. I have done all of this already, so I can stop this process and go back to my application, which is in the this.1 hour. This is the application that I already created earlier. This is a blank Angular application, and this is basically what's being created. before we go into creating our own code and extending the basic application, let's have a look at what the Angular CLI creates for us in order to understand what we are starting with and what we use as a base to create our application. There are a lot of files, obviously. As it's a Node project, it has a package.json file. The package.json file has a lot of dependencies that are required for Angular. Every Angular dependency is prefixed using @Angular. We are, of course, depending on RxJS, a lot of other Angular dev dependencies, and some dependencies for testing, such as Jasmine and Karma and Protractor. Other than the dependencies, we have the scripts that Angular CLI creates for us. As I said, the Angular CLI has a lot of commands, such as ng-new, but we also have ng-serve, ng-build, ng-test, lint, and end-to-end, E2E. So basically, we are going to use ng-serve and ng-build most of the time. ng-serve is used to actually serve our application and test it during development. And ng-build is used to actually build our artifacts to be able to deploy it to a production server or a development server or anywhere you want. There's also an angular.json file. This is probably the most interesting file that you have in the project. I'm not going to cover all the details because there's a lot of content in this file, as you can see. But there are a few important parts that I want to point out in this file. So basically, first, we have the index.html file that is referenced here and the main.ts file. These two files are basically used for our main entry point of our application. The Angular CLI is going to combine the index.html file and the main.ts file and bring them together in order to create our application. So let's move over to these files, as those are the most interesting. The other files that we have here are not really related to Angular. We have the tsconfig, the karma config, browser list file, gitignore, and stuff like that. So in the source directory, we have the main.ts file. The main.ts file is what we have that for bootstrapping our application. So this is actually a file, important to point out. You probably never have to modify any of this. I just want to go through this very quickly. This is how the app module, which we will cover later, which is the main module of our application, as Angular is using a modular structure. This is where our application is bootstrapped using the app module, right? Everything happens in our app module itself. We also have the index.html file, which actually is just an HTML file. The only difference compared to a normal HTML file is that we have this special selector here, something called app root, which does not exist in plain HTML. This is actually a component that's already created for us by the Angular CLI. And the selector for that component is app-root. So if you would have a look in our app folder, you will see that we have one component called app component. You have the HTML file, the source file, the spec file, and also the TypeScript file. And we also have the app module. Let's head over to the app component. And here we can see that a component in Angular is actually a TypeScript class with an add-component decorator. The component decorator has a few properties that you can specify, one being the selector, which is actually the element that we are going to use to refer to the component. As you can see, in the index.html, we had the app root. In our app component, we also have the app root. Then we can define the template URL, which points to our HTML file we have here, and our SCSS file, or our style URLs property, which is an array. So we can have multiple style sheets if we want to, even though I have to admit, I've never had to use case to have more than one, but it's possible if you would need more than one style URL for a single component. And this way, Angular knows that whenever we in our HTML, we encounter a specific selector, Angular knows that it has to combine the HTML file with this TypeScript file and this style sheet file in order to create our component, right? Then, as I said, Angular uses a modular structure. So apart from the app component, we also have an app module. An app module is, again, a TypeScript class with a decorator, in this case, an ng module decorator. You will notice throughout our development in Angular that most of the things that we use in Angular are TypeScript classes that are decorated with something that indicates what it is for Angular. So we had a component, and in this case, we have an ng module. Ng module has a few properties as well. One of them being the declarations. The declarations is actually an array of components or directives that are available in this module. So if you want to use a component or a directive, it has to be available, has to be part of the module. And in this case, we are declaring the app component to be part of the app module. Then we also have the imports array. The imports array is actually defining some kind of dependencies that this module or the components in this module have. So if you would be depending on material, Angular material, or Bootstrap, or you need a date picker from NPM or anything, you probably want to install a package and import the module in the appropriate module. So in this case, we would probably import material module in app module, for example. The providers is basically for services that are not singleton. If you would need any of that, you can provide them in the providers array for the module. And then we have a special one that's used for our app module, which is called Bootstrap. Bootstrap is basically a property that allows us to specify a component that is required to bootstrap our application. This is because in this case, Angular has to create a component outside of the Angular context, let's say. So it has to know which of the components that we have is our root component, or is the component that is used to bootstrap our application. And bootstrap our application basically means which is the component that is defined in index.html. And that's what we define in Bootstrap. So these are the files that are generated. And other than that, there's nothing relevant to the application itself. There's, of course, stuff for testing and for polyfills as well. But the core concept of the application consists of the main.ts file, as I said, which is bootstrapping it with the app module, as mentioned here, which is, again, declaring the app component and using the app component as a bootstrap argument. And that app component is then defined here, which with its HTML file. So the Angular CLI already creates an HTML file, which is pretty huge. I'm not going to cover any of those details. But running the application, if we would go back to the terminal, we could use npm start, which would run ngserve, right? So npm start is configured to run ngserve in our package.json. So we can run ngserve to bootstrap or to run our application. It'll take a little while, but it should be pretty fast. And once it's built, it's done building and it's running, we could see our application running. So as you can see, it's compiling all the artifacts of our application. 50% building, and then our application is running. Okay. So this is the application running from Angular CLI. This is the base application that is being generated by the Angular CLI. Basically, the default application allows you to go to the documentation and to learn Angular and to get up and running pretty easily, which is actually pretty nice. So you can just create a new application, ng-new, run it, and go from there. What you want to do, you want to add a new component, use Angular material, you want to add PWA support, add dependencies, you want to run and watch your tests or build for production. Everything you want is done here. Now, before we continue, let's have a quick look at what we are trying to build today. Of course, we only have an hour, so let's see how much we can cover. But the idea is to create a simple application. In this case, it's a TV show application of some TV shows that I personally like. It's just listing them. So a simple list of our TV shows, and we are able to favorite them or unfavorite them. It's using a backend. It's a Node backend written using Express.js. The backend is not relevant, and I'm not going into any details, but it's just available, and it has a few endpoints, such as one to provide us with all the TV shows, an endpoint to favorite, and an endpoint to unfavorite a show. So first things first, we need to create a few components. But before we can do that, let's go back to our application. our own application and clean out the app component, because the app component has a lot of content. So let's clean it out and put hello world here, and then you will see that we have something very easy, sorry, something very simple that's called hello world. So the first thing we want to have is we want to have a navigation bar or a header or whatever we want to call it. I'm going to call it a nav bar, even though it doesn't have any navigation. However, you could create your component files manually, but I want to show you that the Angular CLI is more than just a way to create an application, right? So let's go back to our terminal. Then you can see that we can use ng. If I would use ng again, you'll get a list of all the commands, and you'll see that there's also something called generate. And generate allows us to create files. So we could do ng generate, or if you're lazy like me, you can use ng-g, which also works. And you can ng generate or ng-g a component, or again, you could use ng-gc, which is ng generate component, and then I call it navbar. Navbar. You need to learn to type navbar. This is going to create a few files for me. As you can see, it created an HTML file, a spec file, a TypeScript file, and a Sass file. But it also updated the app module. So let's have a quick look at the changes that it did. So as you can see, our app module is updated, and it now also has a navbar component in the declarations. The navbar itself, it's created a folder, and we now have 4 components. Navbar component is our TypeScript file with everything set up. We have our selector, the URL, the template URL, the styles URL. So everything is set up to create our component. So what we want here is we want a title, let's call it TV shows, and I also want to include an image. I'm going to copy the image and move it in our assets directory, which is the place where Angular stores all its asset files, such as images, icons, whatever you want. And you can move the logo here. And you can refer to that using the assets/logo.png, right? So if I would save that and I would go back to my application, of course, I created a navbar. I have to use the navbar. As I told you, we created a component called navbar that had a selector app-navbar created by default. So we can now use that component using the app-navbar selector. As you can see now, we have our logo, which is pretty huge, and our title. Cool. So now that we have our HTML and we have our TypeScript file, we basically have all the fundamentals for our component. What is left now is some CSS. So we'll need some CSS to style our components. An Angular component has the ability to style the component itself. Because if you would go back to our application and we would inspect our application, you will see that our component itself is also actually an element of the DOM. Like we have app navbar, which means that we could also style our app navbar element instead of the diffs or the images. We could also apply styles to our navbar. And this is done using the :host selector. The :host selector will apply styles to the host element. So in this case, I added some styles, and this basically shows a header like this, right? So we now know that we can create components using the Angular CLI, that we can add assets such as logos and refer to them using an image, for example, that we can style our components, both normal styling, so we can use the image selector here, which just styles the image inside of our component. It's important to note that by default, Angular only styles. If you apply styles to the component, it only styles that element inside that component. It will not affect images somewhere else in your application. So this is the navbar. The next thing we'll need, because we want to create a list of shows, the next thing we need is we want to create something we want to create another component that's called shows list. This is basically going to be used to list all of our shows, obviously. And again, we can use the Angular CLI, and we have a component and all the files set up for us, which is pretty easily. There's also, by the way, there are also Visual Studio Code extensions, so you can like right-click, add components using the same schematics behind the scenes, so that you don't have to create all the files manually, but you also don't have to leave your Visual Studio Code. Or you could decide to use your terminal inside Visual Studio Code if you want to. Of course. All right. So the shows list. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create an array that contains all of our shows, right? So in this case, we want to have an array that contains all the shows. A show has an ID. Show has a name. I'm going to go with Prison Break. And it has, let me see, a show has a name. It also has a description. Some brothers breaking out of prison. All right, we can use an image URL. That's something for later. And then we have whether or not it's a favorite. All right. Cool. So now we have an array of shows. In this case, only a single show, but we'll connect it to our backend later and not worry about creating too much mock data for now. So we can define properties on our classes, on our component classes, just as we would do with any other TypeScript class, right? But now it's a matter of referring to that property in our HTML file. So basically, we could create a div that is going to be used as every item of our show. And we can use something called ng4. So in Angular, ng4, it's what's used to render multiple items or to iterate over an array and render HTMLs for each item in that array. So we can do let show of shows, and then we can render show.name. This is using interpolation, so we can use 2 curly brackets, and then we can access the object, in this case, a show, which is each item of the array will be available. And then we can just access any property of that show and render it using interpolation, using 2 curly brackets. Of course, again, the same mistake. So in our app component, we already have the app navbar, but we also need the app shows list component. Now we see that Prison Break is rendered, right? Prison Break is the only show that we have for now. So if you would now extend that array, let's add Breaking Bad, which is also a series a TV show that I like, and some teacher needed money, and you'll see that it's added, right? So we can now easily add more items to an array, and our HTML will be updated thanks to the ng4. This is, by the way, called a structural directive. So if you would go into the documentation or you're interested in what this asterisk means, this refers to a structural directive, which basically is some syntactical sugar around something inside Angular, but it basically allows you to, or defines that this directive is responsible for the inner HTML. So it's, in this case, you'll see that this directive is going to create multiple copies of what we are defining here. And so it's going to be responsible to do that. And that's what the structural directive is actually for. There are more structural directives in Angular, such as ngIf and ng4. Those are probably the most common ones. We'll use ngIf later. ngIf is just to hide and show content based on a condition. But then again, that directive is responsible for rendering or not rendering the content. All right, so this is the shows list component. So let's add some more HTML. So I'm going to copy some HTML and I'll explain that for you. So I basically added a few classes like shows list item. I want to show an image. I want to show the name and the description. And I don't need this yet. Sorry, copied too much from my example. I'm copying some stuff over just to save some time to not live code everything, because I know that can go slow, but I also don't want to go too fast because the idea is to learn Angular from scratch, of course. So what we see here, we are binding to the source attribute of our image. So this is using square brackets. So by using square brackets, we can bind to properties of elements. So in this case, we can bind to the source attribute. Normally, we would do something like this. Right? And that would just set the source attribute to a fixed URL. But instead, we are going to use square brackets and bind the image URL of our show to the source property. So now let's find some images. So if you would give me a little second. So for Breaking Bad, we can use this image. And for Prison Break, which is a very cool series, I think I saw all the seasons 2 times or 3 times. You can call me crazy, but I did. And now we can see that we have the images, the title and the description, the image for Breaking Bad, and the title and the description. So we are defining more components. Everything is being rendered, but of course, we still have to provide some CSS. So let's add some CSS, right? So this is the CSS that I'm going to add. And this will make sure that it shows up like this. So what am I doing? I'm basically telling that for every item, I want to have it display flexed, and I want to align items centered. This is going to ensure that they are actually shown next to each other instead of below each other, and that the content is vertically centered. That is what align items does when you are using display flex in a row direction. So basically flex direction row, which is the default value. If you use this, then align items is used to control vertical centering or vertical alignment, actually. We don't need this because that's the default value. I'm applying some paddings. I'm applying some width and heights and object fit cover. Object fit cover is actually pretty cool because it allows for the image. So let me go to the CSS and disable object fit cover. You will see that if we don't use object fit cover, it's going to scale the image. But instead we use object fit cover, and it's going to use cover, which is something that's been used as background for using CSS for backgrounds a lot. But we also have that on our images using object fit. Cool. So we have this now, and we have our shows list. So we have we have added 2 components now. We have added the navbar and we've added the shows list. We are able to use interpolation. And we are able to use attribute binding, property binding. So I want to bring in a new component, another component. So our list, in this case, is rendering some plain HTML. However, I want our shows list component to actually render multiple shows list item components. So I want to go back to my terminal, and I want to create a new component called shows list item. All right, and I want to move some stuff to that component now, right? So I want to do it like this. So we have a component in our shows list. We don't want this anymore. We also don't want to render a div. Instead, we want to render a app shows list item. So just as using ng4 on divs, we can also use ng4 on our own components. In this case, app shows list item. The selector app shows list item is again generated for us by the Angular CLI. So in this case, it's going to render that specific component, in our case, 2 times for each show, and it's going to render our HTML. Great. However, we don't have access to the show in the child component, right? In our shows list component, we have access to all the shows, and we are using ng4 to iterate over all our shows, and we have access to every show separately. However, we need a way to provide that show to our component. And this is where input properties or inputs on components come in. So an Angular component can define its own data, can hardcode stuff, but it can only also accept properties from outside. So we can use @input, which is again a decorator. As I've mentioned, Angular is using a lot of decorators. And we can use show, right? Let's get rid of any first, and let's add a new folder called model. Let's add something that's show.model.ts, and let's create a model for our show. I don't like to use any, so we can use show here, right? So what I've created is just an interface that contains ID, name, image URL, description, and isFavorite. All our strings except for the isFavorite, which is a Boolean. So now we have a more typed application, and we know that the input for our shows list item component accepts a show of type show. So now we have a show property on our component, and we can access the show in our HTML. So this is the exact same HTML as we had in our list component. However, in our list component, we now have to pass the show that we have here to our component. This is done using property binding. So we can do show equals show. So in this case, this show, which is put between the square bracket, refers to what we have as defined in our child component, in our shows list item component, where this refers to what we have here. So let's just, for clarity, rename our show in our list component to item, and then we can use item and assign item to the show property of our shows list item. Cool. So this should work. Okay, so we see our content again, but now our CSS is broken. That's weird, right? Because everything worked, and I didn't change any HTML other than moving stuff around. So if you would have a look, you will see that I still have my div which shows list item. I still have my image, my div with show list item __ content, but still the CSS is not applied. And this is something that I want to discuss, as Angular uses a concept called a view encapsulation. And view encapsulation basically means that Angular is going to assure that every CSS that we define in a specific component, in this case the list component, will only affect the HTML inside that component, but only directly inside that component. It will not affect child of that given component, right? So that means that this is not going to work. There's a few ways that we can fix this, right? One way could be we could move this CSS. So let's do that quickly. We can take this CSS and move it to a file that we have called styles.scss. I didn't mention this file yet, but this is a file that's being created by the Angular CLI and allows us to create global styles. Oh. So we could move this here. And now it works again. So this is a way to provide CSS that works for all components. Even though I don't like this approach, I do think that there is benefit to using global CSS, right? But in this case, I don't think this is our solution. Another way that we can do is in our shows list components. As I said, Angular uses view encapsulation. View encapsulation can be configured using the encapsulation property on our component. And then we can specify view encapsulation, whether or not it's emulated, native, none, or shadow DOM, right? By default, it's emulated. We can set that to none. And now you'll see that our CSS is working again. This means that by using view encapsulation encapsulating none, basically Angular is now taking this CSS and making it globally available and not restricting it only to that specific component, which also has downsides, right? Because if I would do div and I would style a div and let's say color red, for example, this would affect every div in the entire application, which you probably don't want to, because you feel like you're writing CSS specific for this component, but yet this will impact the entire application. So we also don't want view encapsulating none. What we want to actually is pretty easy. We want to move this CSS to the specific component that we just created, called the shows list item component, and use it there. And now the CSS to style each list item is connected to the shows list item component, and the application is again rendered the way we expect it to be rendered, right? So that's great. So great, we have added a few components. We have added a component to show our navigation bar or our top bar, or because we don't have any navigation items, but in the real world, there's probably going to be some navigation items popping up in our top bar. So that's why I call it navbar. We have our shows list, which is actually just responsible for retrieving the shows and rendering shows list items. And then we have a show list item, which is responsible for rendering an item on its own, right? The next thing we probably need is, as I said, we are having a Node.js backend, an Express.js backend. And instead of using a hard-coded array that we have here, we probably want to retrieve our data from our backend. So you want to create a service. For that, we can use ng-generate service and call it show service. Now the Angular CLI is going to create a service and also a spec file for our service. And we can go to our service. And as you can see, all it did was create a class. Again, a TypeScript class with, again, a decorator. In this case, an @injectable. @injectable is what we use in Angular to define our services. Basically, as the name mentioned, it's making it injectable somewhere else. An injectable has a property called provided in. There's several options that you can provide to provide it in, definitely as of Angular 9. The most common one still in Angular 8 or Angular 9, the most commonly used in Angular 8, but also in 9, is root, which actually just makes this service a singleton, right? It just tells to Angular, this service has to exist in the root, and it has to only have a single instance, and there should never be more than one. So this is why we use provided in root. If you want a service that has multiple instances, you can get rid of the provided in. You can go to your app module and you could add the service to the providers array. That's one way. Or you could use provided in, and there should be a way to add this to app module if I'm correct. The benefit of this approach is that it enables tree shaking. Tree shaking is the concept where the compiler or Webpack, sorry, not the compiler, but Webpack determines whether or not your dependency or your service is used. So if I have a service that is imported but never used, it's going to be removed from the bundle, right? But if we would go with this approach, so let me go back and go to our app module, and we would add our service like this. There is no way for Webpack or Angular CLI, but actually Webpack, to know whether or not show service is used, because it is actually used. We are importing it and we are using it, even though this is not actually using it yet. But this makes tree shaking very hard or even impossible with services. That's why it's not recommended to do this if it's not required, and just use the provided in approach with the appropriate scope, either the roots or the module. Cool. So we need a HTTP call. We need to retrieve our data from our API. So we need something called HTTP client. So we need something called HTTP client. In order to use HTTP client, we need to import HTTP client module. Sometimes my Visual Studio Code doesn't like HTTP client module, but it's imported from Angular common HTTP. Right. So by using this, we are having access to all the stuff that Angular provides us for HTTP, such as the HTTP client service. So now inside our show service, we can use private HTTP client, and we can use the HTTP client that is again imported from Angular common HTTP. So now we can create a method called getShows, and now we can return our HTTP client. We use .get. HTTP client has multiple methods: get, post, put, patch, all what you need to do HTTP calls. But in this case, we need get, and I need to speak and cheat and see what our endpoint is called. And our endpoint is called, one second. So this is our endpoint. So we can call localhost on port 4201. This will retrieve all the shows that we have in our backend, right? So now we have our service. Our service has a method, and our method calls the HTTP client, and it calls the get method on that HTTP client. The get method returns an observable, right? Angular uses a lot of RxJS, a lot of observables. So it's pretty important that you understand observables at least a little bit. I mean, you don't have to be an RxJS expert, but you need to understand the concept of an observable. And an observable is something that allows you to work reactively. Like the data will be available now or in the future. It's a lot like promises, but also not a lot like promises. Promises are very different, but promises are also something that allows for an async API. But observables are, I would argue, a lot more powerful than promises. But again, we have an awesome session on RxJS later today from the creator of RxJS, Ben Lesh itself. So if you are interested in learning RxJS, definitely check out that session as well. And for now, let's go to our shows list component. And instead of using our hard-coded array, which we don't want anymore, we are going to use our service, right? So we're going to inject. So Angular uses dependency injection. And we're going to inject our show service, right? And then we can do this.shows equal this.shows service.get shows. There's a convention that we use in Angular, but also outside Angular, that if something is an observable, you add a suffix of a $sign. That basically tells developer that we are working with observables. So in this case, we know that it's an observable of type array show. Of course, this is not going to work because we haven't defined any type in our service. So the HTTP client, by default, the get method returns something that is called observable object. So instead, we can apply the type here, and we can so now TypeScript knows that this service will be returning an observable of type array of show. So now this works. But now this is an observable, right? So this is an observable. I'm not going to go into details into RxJS, but basically you need to subscribe on an observable. So like this, subscribe, in order to get the data. The same way you would need to call .then on a promise, right? However, there is something pretty cool in Angular that's called the async pipe. So we can do this. So now we are still using our ng4, but we are iterating over our observable. Well, not really. We are actually iterating over this. We are iterating over our observable, which we pipe using the async pipe. And basically the async pipe is going to subscribe for us on the observable and retrieve the value from it. And in this case, iterate over the array of shows. As you can see, other than some CSS bug, I have 4 shows now. I have Breaking Bad, Person of Interest, Suits, and Prison Break, which are the 4 shows that are defined in my backend. So we didn't have to change anything to the component or any of the components we had, other than, of course, the async pipe. But now our component is using our service to retrieve the data from our backend. So we actually our data is coming from an API, which we can see. Which we can see here. So our backend is returning our data and it's being rendered in here. So that's pretty cool, pretty easy. All right. So now there's one thing that I want to add, and that's the ability to favorite a show, right? So we can have a list of shows, but we also want the ability to favorite a show. So to interact with a specific list item. For that, I'm going to create another component. And I call it star, which is a component that is actually just going to render a simple star. Like this. So we are creating a button, and the button is going to render a star. We could use a CSS star, we could use an icon or whatever, but for now, we are just going to use some Unicode and render or use a star like this. Cool. Of course, we want to have the ability to click the star. So for accessibility reasons, I've wrapped the star using a button, and the button is going to notify the parent, right? So we're going to create a button, a star component, and that star component has to have some kind of event to notify the parent. So I already showed you how you can use input properties in a component, but the same way you can use outputs. So we can use an output called So there's a question. In the previous version, we called the service in ng on init, but now in the constructor. Is this a new update or because of the async pipe? Well, that's a good question. That's actually because of the async pipe. So this is actually not doing anything yet. This is not subscribing. This is preparing stuff. We could actually just, if you want, you could also just do this. This also works. If you want, you could also move this to the ng on init. That will also work. It's a matter of preference, actually. I prefer to do it in a constructor. There's some people that prefer to do it in the ng on init. Both will work fine, but there's no real rule where to put it, unless you are subscribed. So if you would add a subscription, then I would argue you need to put that in the ng on init, because you also want to unsubscribe or clean up your own subscription. Whenever you create manual subscriptions using RxJS, you also want to clean up your subscriptions, which you do in the ng on destroy, right? So you initialize subscriptions in the on init, but you clean up the subscriptions in the on destroy. However, what we are doing doesn't involve any subscription yet, right? This is not subscribing. Instead, we are using the async pipe. And the async pipe is going to actually subscribe for us, right? And this means that Angular is going to guarantee or take care of it for us, that it's only subscribed in the on init or in some kind of lifecycle, but it should be something on init, but also cleaned up on the on destroy, right? So that's why it doesn't really matter, but I would argue that it's probably better to do it in the constructor as long as you don't add subscriptions. Because it's not about initializing HTTP calls, it's about assigning property values. But that was a good question, definitely. So we want to have an event on our star component. And event emitter is one of the things that is always imported from the wrong place. If I let Visual Studio Code do the import. Why is it complaining? It shouldn't be complaining. Very weird. Okay, I'll see. This should probably work. Very weird. This is a way how you create. This is a way how you create output bindings, output events in Angular. This is using something called event emitter. Event emitter is just a way to emit an event to a parent. So we are defining a property on our component, on our star component called select, right? And our select in this case is, we can call it in our HTML. So whenever we click the button, we call select on our component, and our event emitter, the instance we created, has a .emit method, right? And the .emit method we have has to be called with the inverse of value. Value will be the value that we retrieve for our star. So we also need an input. It's called value, which will be a Boolean, right? Because we want to know whether or not the star is selected, right? So every time we click it, we'll emit an event and notify the parent that the value is now the inverse of the previous value. And then we can just toggle it. That's what we're going to do. Okay. But then we also want to add some styling when we clicked the star, right? So we want to have like a yellow star when it's active and a non-yellow star when it's not active. So we can use the ng class binding. The ng class binding is a way to bind to a class or multiple classes, actually. In this case, we are binding the active class whenever value is true. So if value evaluates to true, or any value in JavaScript that is truthy, actually, so it can be an object, Boolean, string, whatever, as long as it's defined to something we call truthy in JavaScript, the active class will be applied. So now we can go to our start component, and we can add some CSS, right? As we are using a button, I want to get rid of some default button styles. I don't want a background, I don't want the border, I want to change the color and the font size. And whenever the active class is applied, we want to change the color. Cool, so now we have a start. And then we can go to the shows list item component. And then we can render the app star here. And we can use the value is going to be, we're going to bind that to the show.isFavorite, right? So the value will be true if the show is favorite. The value will be false if the show is not a favorite. We also have the select. So output bindings or event emitters, we can bind to them using parentheses. So in this case, we use parentheses select, and then this will be called whenever the select is called. So whenever the button will be clicked. So in this case, we want to have another output, because we actually want to inform our parent component. The list component has to be informed whenever the star is clicked. So our shows list item also needs an event emitter. In this case, we are calling it favorite, right? And it's going to call it using Boolean, which of course here as well. So the event emitter is an output of type Boolean. So we're going to emit true or false. So whenever we click the button, we are going to call that emit event, and it's going to hit here. And then we are going to call our own event emitter again. We can pass $event. $event is something available in Angular that allows us to just pass the event that's being emitted. In this case, it's going to be a Boolean. Use that value and pass it through. So $event will be an object that contains whatever we are emitting in that event emitter. So that means in this case, we are emitting the inverse of value, and the inverse of value will be available as a $event here, right? So now this means that our shows list item has an output of favorite. So we can go to our shows list item, then we can go to our show list. Format this a little bit better so it's readable. And then we can, the same way we did in our list item component, we can do on favorite. Right? And again, we have access to the event. All right. So now we are calling an onFavorite method, which doesn't exist yet. So we'll need to go to our shows list component, our TypeScript file, and ensure that we have an onFavorite method, which has a favorite value, and we can log that favorite value. So if you would go back to our application, you will see that one of the stars is already selected because it's already favorited. The backend is set up to have Breaking Bad as a favorite. If I would click it, you will see that it logs true. If I click person of interest, if I would click Breaking Bad, it will log false, right? Of course, there is no mechanism in place yet to refresh my application, but if I would hit F5, not F5, if I would hit refresh, of course, nothing happened because we didn't hit our API yet, right? We, of course, also have to hook up our click event to our API. So that's the last bit that we need to do. So we need, on our show service, we need a way to also toggle the favorite. For that, we need a show ID, and we need whether or not it's a favorite, right? Then I need to cheat a little bit again and see the URL we need. So this is the URL we need. Okay, and then we can return this.http client, which now needs a post. We can call the URL with no body, right? A post call always requires some kind of body, whether or not it's an empty object or not. The HTTP client of post expects you to provide a body. You can provide an URL if you want to, or an empty object should work as well. So now whenever we click toggle, whenever we call this method, based on whether or not it should favorite, it's going to call favorite or unfavorite, use the HTTP client of post, hit the endpoint, and return the observable, because the post on the HTTP client returns an observable, and returns that observable to our component, which we will be calling here. So now we can use this.showService.toggleFavorite. So we need a show ID, but we don't have a show ID yet, right? So that means that our onFavorite method also needs a show ID. However, we need to provide that show ID in our HTML. But we have access to the show using the item. Right? We can access the item as we are doing by providing it to our input property for our shows list item. We can also access item when we are calling onFavorite. In this case, we provide the item ID and the $event. Again, the $event will be the Boolean value that represents whether or not it's a favorite show. Right? And that is not working. Of course, it's not working because it's an observable, right? Toggle favorite returns an observable, and an observable doesn't do anything as long as you don't subscribe. We can't use the async pipe here, right? When we are retrieving data and rendering data, we can use the async pipe. However, in this case, we cannot use the async pipe, and we need to manually subscribe to ensure that our HTTP call is initialized. So going back to our application, we should see that now that we clicked person of interest, it's favorited. And if we click Breaking Bad, it's unfavorited. If I would refresh the application, you would see that the icons are toggled, right? Of course, we have limited time. Of course, you probably want to ensure that the application reflects the changes. So you want to introduce some kind of state management that whenever an icon is clicked, that it's immediately reflected in the application. You can use an RxJS subject for that, or you can use NGRX for that, NGRX effects, NGRX store, even though just for the purpose of this, that might be a little bit of overkill. But for bigger applications, using something like NGRX is pretty cool. Now, I just want to add one more thing as we're running out of time, but I do want to add one more thing. I want to copy my service that I've created earlier. And it should be working. Okay. As you can see now, it is working. The reason why it's working now, and I don't want to go into too much details because this is some RxJS that's a little bit more complex than the scope of this session, but this introduced some kind of state management inside my show service to ensure that whenever we hit favorite, it's going to keep track of all the shows in a replay subject. Right? This code is available if you want to dig it, if you want to dig through it. If you want me to explain it later offline on Twitter, feel free to reach out. This is just a small example. This is just for demo purposes. This is obviously also a fine pattern to use in your application, but I would recommend using a more structural approach like NGRX or whatever if you want to implement some kind of state management. The code should be available on GitHub. I guess it should. I'm going to see how we were going to communicate the link, but feel free to follow me on Twitter or check my Twitter, and I'll be sure to tweet a link to my source code so you can check it out, definitely. And please do feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. So that's basically it for my demo. So just to recap, we have created several components using the Angular CLI. We created a service using the Angular CLI. We initially created the application using the Angular CLI. So I hope you also see that the Angular CLI is a powerful tool. It allows you to generate our application, generate files, but it also is just the thing that's responsible for building our application and serving our application and running our tests, which we haven't covered. Right? But other than that, I would like to thank you for your time and sticking around. If you would find this training helpful and you would like to learn more, please do let us know. If you have any other feedback or concerns, please also let us know. I like to improve. I like to get better. But we also love to teach even more. Right? This.lab is also offering virtual corporate training, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Contact us at hi@this.co, and we'll see whatever we can do. Great. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope to see you later. Bye.